As Andrea mentioned, my name is Vanessa De Rubeis, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow working with both Andrea and Parminder Raina. So the presentation that I'm going to be giving today is actually some of the work that I completed during my PhD, which I also did at McMaster in the Health Research Methodology program. So the title of my talk today is Understanding Experiences of Stress During the COVID-19 Pandemic Among Canadians. So, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic was really unlike any other disaster that we experienced in recent history, given the wide-scale implications that we saw across the globe. So, similar to other disasters, in addition to the direct impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, such as the morbidity or mortality associated with the virus, there were several indirect consequences that had impacted population health and well-being. So at the start of the pandemic, there was really little known about the potential long-term health impacts associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. So to fill this gap, our research team aimed to our research team was interested to determine what has previously been studied in terms of this association between disasters and long-term health outcomes, specifically on cardiometabolic health. So to fill this gap, we aim to conduct a systematic review to determine the impact of disasters, including pandemics, on cardiometabolic outcomes across the life course. So we did this by conducting a systematic search in May of 2020 on both Embase and Medline. And we were really interested in assessing any studies that assessed an association between any population level disaster and any cardiometabolic outcome that occurred at least 1 month following the disaster. We tried not to be too restrictive as we wanted to include a lot of different types of study. So we didn't restrict on age, year of publication, country, or population. So after we ran our search and we completed screening, we identified 58 studies that were eligible to be included within our review. And the majority of these studies were published in North America between 2010 and 2020 and utilized a cohort or a longitudinal study design. We classified the period of exposure as either exposure during pregnancy and childhood or adulthood exposure. And we found that 41% of the included studies investigated exposure to disaster during pregnancy and childhood. And the remaining 59% of studies investigated exposure to disaster during adulthood. We also classified the type of disaster as either natural disaster or human-made disaster. And we found that 60% of the included studies assessed the impact of a natural disaster. So this included the Ebola epidemic, the 1918 influenza, and several different types of hurricanes. The remaining 40% of studies investigated human-made disasters, which included the World Trade Center disaster and the, in the Holocaust, sorry. So we were interested in any type of cardiometabolic outcome, and we found that the majority of the studies did explore the impact on cardiovascular disease, and about 21% of studies explored the impact on obesity and BMI. So moving on to the results, overall, 47 out of the 58 studies that we identified to be eligible to be included in the review identified increased cardiometabolic risk after exposure to disaster. And this included increased cardiovascular disease, increased diabetes, or increased obesity. So this only left out 11 studies that reported no increased risk or unclear findings. So just to note, these studies were quite heterogeneous in nature, so we couldn't actually meta-analyze these studies just because they were so different. So we were only able to qualitatively synthesize these results within the review. So an example of one study that we included that assessed exposure to disaster during pregnancy was conducted by Mazumber et al. So this study found that those who were in utero during the 1918 influenza pandemic had a 36.7% excess risk of diabetes compared to those who were born after the pandemic. Another example, but now looking at a study that focused on exposure to disaster during adulthood, was conducted by Ann et al. And they found that people who reported higher perceived stress following a hurricane had a higher average BMI compared to those who reported lower perceived stress. And this was found to be statistically significant. So overall, we found that the burden of disasters did extend beyond the known direct harm, and attention is really needed on the detrimental indirect long-term effects on cardiometabolic health. So findings from this review may help to inform public health prevention strategies to mitigate the impact of disasters, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, on future cardiometabolic risk. So when we evaluating these studies and synthesizing the results, we did notice that the mechanisms underlying this association were not well studied, but one potential and hypothesized pathway that was noted was stress. So, taking the findings of this review and given the dramatic change in daily functioning throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, it's evident that several factors, such as limited access to physical activity or different types of closures, may have led to an increase in chronic disease. And one potential pathway that this could followed along was through different types of stress. So, quite early on in the pandemic, there was a systematic review that was conducted that did find there was a high prevalence of stress, and that this differed by different characteristics such as sex, age, unemployment, chronic conditions, and mental health problems. But this study did note that a lot of the studies that were included were quite limited, such as a few of them had quite small sample sizes. It was also not specifically focused on obesity and how people with obesity may have had differential experiences throughout the pandemic. And it's quite possible that people with obesity may have had different experiences because obesity was identified as a risk factor for increased morbidity and mortality associated with COVID-19. But this was really not well understood as how this could increase COVID-19. And it did lead to a lot of bias and stigmas towards people who had obesity. And as you can see on the slide, these were just a few different types of literature that were published surrounding this stigma or bias that was associated with obesity. So this bias and stigma may have increased the possibility that people living with obesity during the pandemic may have had increased stress. So when we think about the impact of stress and obesity during the pandemic, we can apply the framework that you see on the slide that was proposed by van der Valk et al. And this framework really helps to understand the complex relationship that obesity and stress share. So as you can see on the slide, obesity and stress are constantly influencing each other. And you can see that this is through a cyclical or bidirectional association. So also you can see on this figure that stress and obesity impact each other, and this can be through several different mechanistic pathways, which include lifestyle or behavioral factors, a genetic response, or a stress response. So talking and focusing in on stress, we know that stress takes many forms across the life course. So for instance, a major stressor in a person's life is adversity that occurs during childhood. So adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs for short, include a wide range of negative events that occur during childhood and adolescence, and this includes things like abuse or neglect. So the literature has found that ACEs influence the development of obesity later in life. So another example of a stressor or a stressful event, as we all know, is the COVID-19 pandemic. And the COVID-19 pandemic essentially altered daily functioning across the globe, which could have led to increased stress. So understanding this relationship is of particular interest, given that about 26% of Canadian adults are said to have obesity. And this is also important as obesity is not only a disease, but is also a risk factor for several other diseases, including cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and can increase the risk of stress. So finally on this figure, you can see that the association between stress and obesity is impacted by several different factors. And these are at the micro, the meso, and the macro level. So for a few examples, at the micro level, this includes things like age and sex. At the meso level, it includes interactions with family and friends. And at the macro level, it includes economic supports for families. So if we think back to early on in the pandemic, there was very limited research that was done that took a comprehensive approach to explore both proximal and distal risk factors for stress that was experienced during the pandemic. If we take a look back at that cyclical association between stress and obesity, it helps to identify potential factors that may play a role in differential experiences throughout the pandemic. And this includes things like individual characteristics, adverse childhood experiences, and adulthood obesity. So that brings us to the overall objective of my talk today, which is to understand the experiences of stress during the COVID-19 pandemic among Canadian adults. And to meet this objective, I'm going to discuss two distinct manuscripts that each had their own unique objective. So the first manuscript aimed to describe stress during the COVID-19 pandemic by socioeconomic factors. And the second was to determine how adverse childhood experiences and obesity impacted stress during the COVID-19 pandemic. So to answer these objectives, and for both of the manuscripts that I'm going to discuss today, we use data from the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, which is also known as the CLSA. So the CLSA is a national prospective cohort study that has collected data on over 50,000 adults aged 45 years and older at the time of recruitment. As you can see on the slide, the CLSA has several different data collection time points. So baseline was collected from 2011 to 2015. Follow-up one was collected from 2015 to 2018. And in April of 2020, the CLSA COVID-19 questionnaire study was launched, which collected pandemic-related data over 9 months. So this was from April of 2020 to December of 2020. So focusing in on the COVID-19 exit survey, there was about 24,000 participants who completed the survey. But for my specific projects, we did exclude some people who are missing data on both our exposures and our outcomes of interest. So it left us with a sample of about 23,785 participants. So on the slide here, you can see some of the characteristics of the study participants. So for example, you can see that 55% of the sample were female, 58% had a household income between 50,000 to 150,000. The majority of participants were of older age, so age 65 to 96 years of age, and 97% of the sample were of white racial background. Focusing in on adverse childhood experiences, we see that 61% of the sample reported one or more adverse childhood experience, and about 31% of the sample were said to have obesity. So at the COVID-19 exit survey, participants were also asked about how they were experiencing the pandemic. And the measures that I'm going to discuss that we use in this study have previously been used in other disaster research, but were modified for our study to fit the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the first measure of stress was an objective measurement. So participants were asked to report if they had experienced any of the 12 stressors that you can see on the slide. So these included things like if a participant was ill, if they had lost their income, if they were unable to care for others, if there was increased conflict or breakdown in family relationships. So we treated each of these stressors as separate count outcomes, but then we also created a total stressor score where we summed the number of stressors people experienced. So this score ranged from 0 to 12. And on the bottom half of the slide, you can actually see the distribution of this total stressor score. So on the y-axis, you could see the number of stressors, which ranged from 0 to 12. And then on the y-axis, you could see the proportion of people who experienced each of the number of stressors. And interestingly, you see that the majority of the sample did report at least one stressor. So this left with us with only about 24% of the sample who reported experiencing none of the 12 stressors from that list on the previous slide. We went further and actually classified these stressors into 4 stressor domains. So this was the health, resources, relationships, and caregiving domain. So based on the type of stressor, they each fit into one of these domains. So you can see in the health domain, these included stressors such as if a participant was ill, if someone close to them was ill, or if someone died. And then you can see in the other domains, the range of stressors varied based on how many stressors fit within each of those domains. On the bottom half of the slide, you could see the proportion of people who experience one or more stressor within each of the domains. So we see that in the relationships domain, just over half of the sample reported at least one or more stressor. And in both the health and resources domains, we see that just about 30% of the sample reported at least one or more stressor within both of those domains. So the last measure of stress that we had was the perceived consequences of the pandemic. So this is a subjective measurement based on a model that was developed by Lazardis and Folkman called the transactional model. And this model states that when a person experiences a stressful event, they complete a cognitive appraisal. And through this cognitive appraisal, they determine if a threat is perceived with this stressful event. And if they are unable to cope, then it is said that they are experiencing stress associated with this event. So for our specific study, participants were asked about how they would describe the consequences of the pandemic on them and their household. And you can see on the slide that response options range from very negative to very positive. So on the bottom half of the slide, you can see the distribution of responses where we see on the x-axis the different response options, and on the y-axis you see the proportion of people who responded each of these options. And you can see that very few people responded to the very extreme options of very negative and very positive. So we actually went ahead and collapsed these. So very negative with negative and very positive with positive. And then we further collapsed very positive and positive with neutral because we were really interested in understanding negative experiences associated with the pandemic. So now moving on to the first manuscript. So this was titled Stressors and Perceived Consequences of the COVID-19 Pandemic Among Older Adults. And this paper is currently published in CMAJ Open. So the specific objectives of this paper were to describe the prevalence of stressors and the perceived consequences of the pandemic reported by older adults, and to evaluate how they differed by different socioeconomic factors. So to meet these objectives, we utilized a cross-sectional study design, and this was because all of our stress outcomes came from the COVID-19 exit survey. We were interested in several different socioeconomic factors. So this included sex, age, urban-rural status, region of residence, essential worker status, household income, marital status, racial background, and education. And each of these different factors were taken from the various CLSA surveys. So that brings us to the statistical analyses. So to evaluate the association between all of those socioeconomic factors and the different stress outcomes, we use both logistic and negative binomial regression to estimate prevalence ratios and 95% confidence intervals. And we adjusted all models for the variables that you can see listed on the slide. The next few slides are just going to show some of the distributions of these different stress variables at the COVID-19 exit survey. So just as a reminder, this was quite early on in the pandemic from September to December of 2020. So this first figure here shows the total number of stressors reported stratified by age group. So on the x-axis, you can see the number of stressors reported, and this is stratified into 3 different age groups. So 50 to 64 years of age, 65 to 74 years of age, and 75 to 96 years of age. So you can see that the oldest age group, so those who were 75 to 96 years of age, had the highest proportion of people who reported experiencing 0 of the stressors. And then interestingly, you see that when we look at those who reported 5 or more stressors, this was the highest among the youngest age group, which was people who were 50 to 64 years of age. So moving on to the next figure, this is the prevalence of the individual stressors. So these are the 12 stressors that made up the score in the previous slide. So on the x-axis, you could see each of the different stressors that participants were asked about. And this figure stratified by sex. So you see the lighter gray bars represent males and the darker bars represent females. And if we look across almost all the stressors aside from loss of income, we see that females were more likely to report that they experienced a stressor relative to males. The final figure on the slide here is showing the perceived consequences of the pandemic, and this is once again stratified by sex. So on the x-axis, we see the response options of negative and very negative versus neutral, positive, and very positive when people were asked to describe how the consequences of the pandemic were on them in their household. So we can see if we look at females again, we see there's a higher proportion of females who reported the consequence of the pandemic to be negative and very negative on them in their household. But something that we found was really interesting was that in males, about 17%, and in females, about 20%, they actually reported that the consequence of the pandemic were neutral, positive, or very positive on them and their household. So they actually didn't find the consequence of the pandemic to be very negative for them. So now I'll move on to the regression analyses. So this is where we explore the association between the different socioeconomic factors and our different stress measures during the COVID-19 pandemic. So there's quite a lot going on this slide, but I am going to highlight just some of the key findings. So on this slide here, you see just 6 of the stressors. So this included if a participant was ill, if someone close to them was ill, if someone close to them died, loss of income, and unable to access necessary food or supplies, and unable to access healthcare. And we see the associations with some of the socioeconomic factors with each of these stressors. So one interesting finding is if you look in the second row was by age group. So you can see that across almost all of the stressors that are listed on the slide, people in the older age groups were less likely to report that they experienced the stressor relative to those in the youngest age group, which were people aged 50 to 64 years of age. Another interesting finding was by marital status. So if you look at where the arrow is pointing, this shows that people who reported being divorced or separated were 35% more likely to have issues accessing necessary food or supplies compared to those who were married or in a common law relationship. So now on this slide, we see the remaining 6 stressors. So this includes unable to access usual prescription, increased conflict, separation from family, increased caregiving, unable to care for those who require assistance, and breakdown in family relationships. And we see some interesting findings across some of these socioeconomic factors again. So if we look at the fourth row, we see differences by regions across Canada. So we can see that for people residing in Ontario, the Prairies, and British Columbia, they were typically more likely to report that they had experienced the stressor compared to those who were in the Atlantic provinces. But when we look at Quebec, we actually see some differences. So if you look at where the arrows are pointing, this is for unable to access usual prescriptions, separation from family, and increased caregiving. We see that people residing in Quebec were less likely to experience these stressors compared to those in the Atlantic provinces. But then for the remaining stressors, increased conflict and breakdown in family relationships, we see that people in Quebec were more likely to report these stressors compared to those who resided in the Atlantic provinces. So one final interesting finding from these 6 stressors was by sex. So we can see that females relative to males were more likely to report being separated from family, increased caregiving, and unable to care for those who required assistance, and breakdown in family relationships. And this is once again relative to males. That brings us to the next measure of stress, which was the total number of stressors. So once again, this was those 12 stressors that were summed together. And we do see interesting findings across the socioeconomic factors. So once again, we see with males versus females that females were 20 times more likely to report an additional stressor compared to males. And interesting findings again by age group, where we see those older age groups were less likely to report an additional stressor compared to that younger age group. The final analysis results are for the last stress outcome, which was the perception of the consequences of the pandemic. And similarly, we see difference by the different socioeconomic factors. And focusing in on region, we do see that people who resided in Quebec relative to the Atlantic provinces were less likely to perceive the pandemic as negative or very negative compared to people in the Atlantic provinces, where we see people who resided in Ontario, the Prairies, and British Columbia more likely to perceive the consequence of the pandemic as negative or very negative compared to those who lived in the Atlantic region. So it's apparent that adults across Canada experience stress and perceive the consequences of the pandemic as negative or very negative throughout the pandemic. And this did vary by different socioeconomic factors and geography, highlighting inequalities in experiencing stress. So this did highlight the need that continued research will be needed to explore future health outcomes and how they may be related to stress during the pandemic, specifically focusing on how these may vary by different socioeconomic factors. That brings us to the second manuscript, which was titled Obesity and Adverse Childhood Experiences in Relation to Stress During the COVID-19 Pandemic. And this paper is published in the International Journal of Obesity. So the objectives of this manuscript were to evaluate the associations between adverse childhood experiences and stress during the pandemic and obesity and stress during the pandemic, and to examine if the association between obesity and stress during the pandemic was modified by adverse childhood experiences. For this specific study, we utilized a longitudinal study design, and this was because both of our exposures, which were ACEs and obesity, were taken from CLSA follow-up 1. And then once again, all of our stress measures came from the COVID-19 exit survey. So as I mentioned, we had 2 exposures of interest for this study. So our first exposure was adverse childhood experiences. So participants were asked to report if they had experienced any of the 8 adverse childhood experiences before the age of 18. And you can see all of these 8 experiences listed on the slide. So we summed these 8 experiences together to create a total score, which ranged from 0 to 8. But when we looked at the distribution, we actually saw very few people report 5 or more experiences. So for all the analyses, we did actually collapse 4 to 8 ACEs together. The second main exposure of interest was obesity. So in the CLSA, some participants self-report their height and weight, and then some participants actually get their height and weight measured by trained research assistants. So to combine those self-reported and measured weights, we had to apply correction factors to overcome biases associated with self-report. And then we use those height and weight measures to calculate BMI. To classify BMI, we use World Health Organization standard cutoffs. So you can see those cutoffs listed on the slide. And we further classified obesity into severe class obesity 1, 2, and 3. So that brings us to the statistical analyses. So for objective 1, we were interested in ACEs and obesity as separate models, and we ran those with each of our stress outcomes. So we used Poisson, negative binomial, and logistic regression to estimate relative risks in 95% confidence intervals. And we ran both adjusted and unadjusted models, and you could see the variables we adjusted for up on the slide. Objective 2 was where we were interested in understanding if the presence of ACEs modified the association between obesity and each of our stress measures. So prior to this analysis, we actually dichotomized our ACEs variables. So this means we looked at people who reported no adverse childhood experiences versus anyone who reported 1 or more. And to actually explore effect modification, we assessed interaction on both the multiplicative and the additive scales. So to evaluate the multiplicative scale, we estimated the ratio of relative risks, which is known as the RRR. And on the additive scale, we estimated the relative excess risk due to interaction, which is known as the RERI. Here on this slide, we see the results from objective 1, where we evaluated the associations between adverse childhood experiences and obesity with each of our stress outcomes. But just for the sake of time, I've taken out the perceived consequence of the pandemic variable. So when we look at adverse childhood experiences with each of our stressor domains and the total number of stressors, we actually found a dose-response association. So this means as the number of adverse childhood experiences reported increased, it increased the risk of reporting an additional stressor within each of our domains and our total number of stressors score. So just focusing in on 2 examples, we can see that people who reported 4 to 8 adverse childhood experiences relative to 0 were 53% more likely to report an additional stressor in the resources domain and 44% more likely to report an additional stressor within the caregiving domain. We saw somewhat consistent findings when we were looking at obesity with the health and resources domain and the total number of stressors score. Whereas obesity level increased, the risk of reporting an additional stressor also increased. So once again, just looking at 2 examples, we can see that people with severe class 3 obesity were 38% more likely to report an additional stressor within the resources domain and 25% more likely to report an additional stressor within the health domain. And this was compared to those who were of normal weight. So that brings us to the results from objective 2, where we were interested in understanding if ACEs modify the association between obesity and each of our different stress measures. So overall, we didn't find consistent evidence of interaction on either the additive or multiplicative scales. But we did identify one multiplicative interaction to be significant. So this was between class 3 obesity and adverse childhood experiences for stressors within the health domain. So as you can see on the slide, because the RERI is less than 0 and the RRR is less than 1, this indicates that among people with class 3 obesity, those with adverse childhood experiences compared to those without were less likely to report an additional stressor within this health domain. So overall, we did see that experiences across the life course, including obesity and adverse childhood experiences, were associated with increased stress during the COVID-19 pandemic, which confirms that subgroups of people were more susceptible to stress associated with a stressful event like the COVID-19 pandemic. So the 2 studies we conducted were using data from the CLSA, which provided us with evidence that suggests people had different experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. And these were related to both proximal and distal factors, including factors like age and sex, adversity that occurred during childhood, and adulthood obesity. There were several strengths and limitations to both of these studies. So one major strength was this was one of the first studies that was conducted to take a comprehensive approach to describe stress and associated factors that occurred during the pandemic in Canada. And we were able to use the Canadian longitudinal study, which is a large nationally generalizable sample that recruited people using a population-based sampling strategy. A major strength is that the CLSA is still collecting data. So this will allow for longitudinal study to be conducted that can explore how stress may impact future health outcomes, including long-term health outcomes. So a limitation was that the participants that we've included within this study were primarily of white racial background. So this does limit the representativeness, but we can still generalize the findings from our studies to people who share similar characteristics to those who were included within our study. Another limitation was that the stressor list that we were working with was developed quite early on in the pandemic. And as we all know, we went through several subsequent waves of the pandemic. So the stressor list may not have captured all the relevant stressors that people may have experienced, but we did still have quite a few different stressors that may have captured people's experiences. The final limitation was that the CLSA COVID-19 questionnaire study was only launched for those 9 months, so during the first wave of the pandemic. So we unfortunately don't have long-term COVID-19 related data collected, but there are subsequent CLSA follow-ups that are being collected, so it still does allow for different types of research questions to be asked. So that sort of leads to the future research that can be conducted. So we were unable to really explore any mechanistic pathways between stress and obesity and stress. So that may be one future area for people to explore, given that this can help to develop targeted intervention and prevention strategies. And as I've said quite a few times during this presentation, we do need continued research to understand the lasting effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this could be with stress associated with the pandemic on several different types of long-term health outcomes, which can be answered using the CLSA. So in case you didn't have enough of me and you want to read some more, all three of the papers I did discuss today are published. So I've put the QR codes up on the slides, but if you do want me to send you them, you can send me an email. Yeah, so I would just like to thank my PhD supervisor, Dr. Laura Anderson, my thesis committee members, Dr. Lauren Griffith, Dr. Jean-Eric Tarid, and Dr. Andrea Gonzalez. And I also worked with supervisors at the Public Health Agency of Canada and several different collaborators that you can see up on the slide. And this research was really made possible with the data that was collected by the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, and funding was received by both the Public Health Agency of Canada and the Canadian Institute for Health Research. So thank you everyone for listening today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.